Tonight, I'm going to tell you a personal story of how God taught me about faith in my prayers. Faith is my strongest spiritual gift. I have learned that I can believe when others don't. Prayer is also one of my gifts, and I continue to learn the power that God can provide through prayer. But just because these gifts were given to me doesn't mean that I haven't had to be tested by God in those areas, nor does it mean that I can't improve. God showed me that in 1982. We've been talking about Lent in Jesus' last week before his crucifixion. We learned how we don't necessarily worship him as well as we could. And we learned that when we talked about Mary washing Jesus' feet with the expensive perfume and the glory given to Jesus the next day in Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday. And last week we talked about Jesus on a bad day, a day he cursed a fig tree and overturned the money changer's table. Today, I want to go back to Mark 11 and pick up right where we left off. So if you would please turn in your Bibles to Mark 11. We're going to read verses 20 through 24. Mark 11, starting with verse 20. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." Jesus is telling his disciples that faith and prayer can do the impossible. Here is my story about how God taught me this lesson and strengthened those gifts that he had given me. I have shared in the past how we lost a son one year near Christmas. The following year, I lost a second child, only in the early part of the pregnancy. Needless to say, despite having two healthy children already, my heart longed for another child. It took a bit of time, but we were finally blessed with another pregnancy. Because I'd lost the previous two babies, the doctors determined that I was high risk, and extra measures were taken during that pregnancy. The kicker was that we moved from Milwaukee to Portage during that time because Tom had gotten a new job. Well, back then, he did not get health insurance until he had been working for 90 days. And so, because I was pregnant, he was extremely concerned about having medical coverage, and he insisted we carry his health insurance, even though it would come out of our pocket during those 90 days. I argued we didn't need it. It was cheaper to just pay the doctor for the visit. We would have insurance by the time the baby was born, and that was the big bill once we were in the hospital. Well, Tom won that battle. You see, faith was not his gift. And being the responsible man that he was, he wanted to care for and protect his family. God stretched those dollars, and more important, he gave me the grace to bite my tongue during that time. When I was carrying the first child we lost, I knew something was wrong during that pregnancy. I also knew a few months after we lost him that God would allow me to experience a miscarriage. I knew the emotional toll was different, and I knew he wanted me to experience both of those. And so I wasn't surprised when I had the knowledge that this child would be born with some type of defect. Now, I use that word defect loosely because God doesn't make mistakes. And defect is a word we use when things don't measure up to our standards. And though I was certain that something was wrong with the baby, I never shared that with my husband. The previous losses had been very hard on him, and there was no point in worrying him. Sure enough, the day after I delivered him, we're in the hospital in Milwaukee. Remember, I was high risk, so I had to deliver the baby there. The doctor came in and told me that our son had a heart defect. Now, they didn't know how severe it was, but he could refer us to a specialist in Milwaukee, or he could refer us to a specialist in Madison. And Madison was only 45 minutes away from home versus 2 hours. Now, the doctor kept emphasizing the seriousness of this to me. And I realized that the look on my face must have been what I was feeling inside. And what I was feeling inside was relief, because a heart murmur was nothing compared to what my imagination had conjured up over the past months. Later on, when I shared the doctor's news with Tom, there was relief in him as well. Unbeknownst to me, God had been preparing him for the fact that we'd be given a child with a health problem. We just never discussed it because we were trying to protect the other. Kind of ironic. Our new son, Peter, did okay. He would get a little stenosis around his upper lip, indicating he wasn't getting as much oxygen as he should have. But we got used to it. We had to learn infant CPR and had more doctor visits than I care to even remember. But he was still in the 90 percentile for growth when he saw the doctors. Life went on. Until one morning when I woke up early. Tom worked swing shift and was working the night shift that night, so he wasn't home yet. And he wouldn't be home for an hour or so. I went to the crib and I picked up the baby, even though he appeared to be sleeping. And I looked at him, and the bluish tinge above his lip was soon his entire body. I knew he wasn't alive. I can't tell you all the thoughts that went through my head in those moments. I can tell you I cried as I held my 3-month-old son, dead, in my arms. I cried for my husband who wasn't there to rush us to the hospital. I cried that I had 2 preschoolers still asleep in the next room, because what would I do with them so I could save my dead son? But mostly, I cried to God, screaming at him, asking him why he would do this to me again. I cried out to him as I hugged that lifeless child. I paced around the house because I didn't know what to do with him or myself. I can tell you calling 911 never entered my head. I was too busy screaming at God and crying. And then it happened. The baby began to cry. By the time his father got home a short time later, it was hard to believe my tale of trauma. Later, the doctors didn't believe me either. Children don't die to the point of turning blue and then come back to life. And so they ran tests on him. He died on the table during the test, and the doctor was amazed and did the test again to make sure. They still didn't know what was causing it. He should not be dying. But they now knew I had told the truth. Life changed for us. No one would watch him. They were all afraid he'd die, and nobody wanted it on their watch. And those attitudes fueled my fear that he'd never get better. And I could only imagine the worst case scenario that the doctors would play for us. A friend from church told us one of their children had been born with a heart murmur, and he was fine today. Well, we knew he was fine because he worked with my husband. And our families would even get together sometimes because our kids were close in age. But I knew that my situation was different. I had held a dead child in my arms, and she hadn't experienced that. My pity train was gaining full momentum. Now, we taught our children to say their prayers at bedtime. And one night, our 4-year-old daughter prayed, "In Jesus, please heal Peter's broken heart." Well, I chuckled to myself. We tend to think of a broken heart more figuratively, like we talk about heartache and heartbreak. But she was probably more accurate in her prayers than we were. What we called a congenital heart problem, she called a broken heart. The next day, I was taking the children to their grandparents' house, and they lived about half an hour away. And because it was distracting for me to listen to their chatter and to be answering their questions, and sometimes they'd get into little spats, we just kept a supply of music in the car. And so I plugged in one of their tapes. This was the cassette tape era. And I was listening to them sing. And one of their favorites came on, and they're belting it out at the top of their lungs. But the song caused me to pause. And the song was "He's Able." And if you're not familiar with it, here are some of the words. He's able, he's able. I know my Lord is able. I know my Lord is able to carry me through. He healed the brokenhearted, and he set the captive free. He made the lame to walk again, and he caused the blind to see. Oh, he's able. I actually replayed that song several times. And the kids were in the back, so they didn't see the tears that were running down my face. But God had taught me through that bedtime prayer to just fix Pete's broken heart, and through a child's song reminding me that this is what Jesus does as he heals the brokenhearted. I needed her faith in my prayers because he is truly able. A new responsibility was also on my shoulders. I needed to learn to pray better. My prayers over a dead infant were desperate cries. They were not formal prayers. And that's where my prayers need to come from deep in my heart. Over the years, my faith has grown. And when it was at its weak points, I would remember this instance of God's faithfulness in my life. And I'd smile, knowing that I can move a mountain. I still doubt sometimes when I pray, but God's faithfulness is always there. I just need to remember to talk to him.